Okay, so in my book review of Gray, I point out that his other mission, which is very inexplicable, is we have anti-Paul writings now in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once you have an expert like Eisenman break it down and show you how he knows that it's Paul versus James in there. So I point out here, Gray also admits that a portion of the Dead Sea Scrolls had been determined by a preeminent Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, Robert Eisenman, to reflect the bitter interchange between James and Paul over Paul's doctrine of salvation. In 2006, we summarized Eisenman's works in this subject area in Chapter 12 of our book, Jesus Words Only. Gray, and you can just click the link here and you read it free online. You don't have to buy anything. Gray, 10 years later, not only missed our work, but also overlooked the underlying work of Eisenman from 1998. Think about how many years he's had this opportunity. He's writing in 2016, so he's got 2 plus 16. He's got 18 years within which he could have, by accident even, read Eisenman. So should somebody who's a Christian working at a school, a theology professor, should he know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls talking about the Ebion? I think that should have come to his attention somehow, but it didn't apparently. That's all we can assume. Gray, 10 years later, 10 years, that's after my book. So then he had 10 years of notice from my book. So if you were doing a study on anti-Paulinism, I think you might come across a book entitled Jesus Words Only, or Did Jesus Condemn Paul as a False Apostle in Revelation 2:2. Could be the title, might give it away. Okay. But he also overlooked the work of Eisenman from 1998, who said the DSS reflect writings by the Ebion, whom refer to a certain character as the spouter of lies. Obviously, Paul, in context, this lying figure is battling the Zadik, the Hebrew word for just one, over the doctrine of faith alone. Coincidence? Eisenman says this moniker, just one, is the well-known nickname or moniker of James the Just. That's why he's called the Just. In Hebrew, that would be James the Zadik, who wrote the epistle James in our New Testament. Hence, among the Dead Sea Scrolls are 2 documents that reflect what Gray would describe as anti-Paul writings. I should point out it's much more than 2 documents. It's 2 documents of the justification by works. They're both entitled that. Then there's the Habakkuk Pesher, which is trying to prove that this bad guy, this spouter of lies, actually fulfills the prophecy of the bad person who's evil inside the book of Habakkuk. And they're trying to refute the spouter of lies view that Habakkuk 2 verse 4 is salvation by faith, and instead they claim it's salvation by steadfastness, because the word in Hebrew is emunah, which means steadfastness, and that means faithful obedience to them. But the spouter of lies is contending it means faith alone. Okay, I mean, you'd have to live in a cave to not know this is unless the most freakish, weird thing happened. And they're called the Ebion, which matches our early church. So, Eisenman isn't just right. It's beyond even question. It's beyond any question. So I'm going to actually open up the chapter here of chapter 12 and see if we should read anything here. Yeah, okay. Well, it'll fit. So in chapter 12, I call it the Ebionite records of the trial of Paul. So I go through there and why are there no other Ebionite writings? So until the Dead Sea Scrolls, all we had was these opposition statements by Epiphanius, Eusebius, Irenaeus. That's all you had to know who were these people. I mean, it's just like complete blackout. Well, you have complete censorship in the 300s, 400s, people being discouraged and terrorized. These are quotes from scholars. Discouraged and terrorized people all over the eastern provinces of the empire, wishing to avoid any possible suspicion, began to actually burn their libraries. This is in 371, when Emperor Valens is going with troops from house to house to get the books, the Ebion. We've got to destroy all their works. I mean, this is how this is how determined they were to go after them. They were just completely being routed in the Western Empire, but they survived in the Eastern Empire, as we'll see. Not in the Eastern Empire, but in they had to go out to Arabia and the Caucasus Mountains and Russia, and they had to go different places. So the argument comes, where is Professor Eisenman's book on this the first book he did on this, and now all his subsequent books have another further amplification on the original. So if you want to read what his original thoughts were, he first put them down in the book called James, the Brother of Jesus. And he claimed that we have recovered some of the Ebionite writings among the Dead Sea Scrolls. How so? Many of the sectarian works of the Dead Sea are written by a group who in Hebrew call themselves the Ebionim, or Ebion, the poor. They even describe themselves as the congregation of the poor. The poor of the Dead Sea Scrolls claim to be followers of the way, kid you not, he says, and they claim to be part of the new covenant. Who could that be? They claim to have found the Messiah, who is called the Prince of the Congregation and the Teacher of Righteousness. He is gone, killed at the urging of the priests of Jerusalem after the departure of the Messiah, who they believe will return. The temporal leader, the guy who's in charge now, who led the poor, was called the Just One, or the Zaddik in Hebrew. Furthermore, their leader, the Zaddik, is in a struggle against the spouter of lies who seeks to seduce the new covenant community from following the law of Moses. Yeah, if you don't think this is Paul and James, you're living in a cave, sir, ma'am. That's all I have to tell you. The poor, the Ebion, reject the idea of Habakkuk 2:4 means justification is by faith and insist its meaning is justification by faithfulness. The Dead Sea Scrolls, Ebion, have two writings, both called Justification by Works, which reaffirm their rejection of the position of the spouter of lies. The title says all you need to see. When we compare the Ebion of the Dead Sea Scrolls to what Eusebius describes as the Ebionites, the similarities are striking. The Christian sect of Ebionites seem to match the writings of the poor, or Ebionim, whose writings were found in the Dead Sea site at Qumran. These Dead Sea Scrolls reflect ideas and thoughts that are unmistakably Christian. The question is whether the writings of the poor found at Qumran predate or postdate Christ. Unfortunately, this cannot be done by carbon dating the papers found at the Dead Sea. Such dates only tell us the date of the age of the paper. Carbon dating cannot tell us the date of the writing on the paper, yet we have other reliable means to identify the date of the activity of the people whose writings were preserved at Qumran. 57 to 69% of all the coins in the Dead Sea caves are from the period 44 to 69 AD, part of the Christian era. So that's a pretty large segment, and the theory, the Golb, is that the Dead Sea Scrolls were put there in the siege of Jerusalem that was coming right up to 69, 70 AD. So before that library would be burned and destroyed by the Romans, the priests had the good sense of using that hidden tunnel that the Romans didn't know about, called the Hadrian's Tunnel, underneath the temple. It goes all the way out, and they can get out without being spotted, and then they can bring all these writings, all the 7 copies of Isaiah, the 7 copies of Hosea, all the multiple copies that they've been copying for hundreds of years at that temple. They're going to take them all out, put them in the driest cave they can find at Qumran, and hopefully not forget about them. But the wipeout of the temple was so well done, those archives couldn't be retrieved because why? 1.5 million people died in that siege. Basically, almost every single Jewish person. They fought to the death to save their temple. So you can see the same people who put the archives out in the desert were willing to stay behind and die to try to save that temple itself. But they knew that if they died, they had saved the writings themselves. So Golb puts this all together, and one more thing you need to know is that there was a mistaken idea that this was a monk area where they were making copies of the Bible. There were absolutely none of the clips that you will find in order to make copies of books. You need to stay on a line, because otherwise you have to stay on the line in both the source and the target text. Otherwise you're going to get screwed up. So they use these clips to keep track of where they are, and they're none anywhere in the dust or dirt of Qumran. They're just caves with all these books. That's all it is. And then there was a mistaken idea that it was a monk area because there were about like 30 or 40 plates sitting around. And they figured, well, there must be 30 or 40 people eating there. Well, it didn't take too long for the Israeli Archaeology Society to conclude, oops, this is not having anything to do with a monk community. This is a clay plate factory. They make clay plates out here and using some water slough that comes through the Qumran area in the rain, and they can make from the clay, the perfect clay out in Qumran, they can turn them into plates. Oh boy, what a big mistake this was about that. Anyway, let's continue here. Thus, the only way to know whether Christians or non-Christians wrote these writings is to study the words on the pages. Professor Eisenman finds significant proofs of Dead Sea Ebionim is a Christian group. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the temporal ruler of the Ebion who succeeds the killed Messiah who will return is called Zadik. Numerous ancient sources outside the Dead Sea Scrolls identify James the Just as the Zadik. Translated, this means the just one. Jerome, by the 400s, will call him James the Just. In Christian writings of that era, the name of James was rarely used. This is important. He was merely called the Zadik. I mean, so that means this word inside the Dead Sea Scrolls matches identically some person who's the head of the Ebion of the Christians, we know is James, and this same person in other literature, non-Christian literature, would refer to James the just by his title of the Zadik. You can't make this stuff up. And Eisenman is the only guy who knows all of these type of things. As we saw previously, James the Zadik was the first bishop of Jerusalem after Jesus' resurrection. He's also Jesus' brother, by the way. So is it then mere coincidence that the head of the Ebion of the Dead Sea Scrolls is called a Zadik? Of course not. Professor Eisenman appears to have stumbled upon a major controversy. I'm going to say it's well beyond that. No one has ever come out to try to refute him. You know why? Because it's irrefutable. What they do is they ignore him. Why would Christians and not Jews, why would Christians ignore Eisenman? Why would the Catholic Church ignore Eisenman? Because the Dead Sea Scrolls were held captive by the Catholics from the 1940s all the way to 1995, I think it was, because they knew who the Ebionim, and they didn't want anyone to know about it. And now when the Protestants get to see the same thing, and now we get to piece it together, and we have Eisenman even, drawing a cartoon. Cartoon. It's so simple and easy to prove. It's like a cartoon proof. You don't need much mental acuity to know this is about our original church. Well, the Protestants ignore it even more, because this gives validity to the anti-Paul movement from the very beginning, because it's reflected, and you can see it's very well thought out. Habakkuk 2 verse 4. They had two main arguments. Number one, it doesn't mean what the spouter of lies claims, and they are 100% correct. In our articles on on Habakkuk and Pesher and its fulfillment in Paul, we do discuss the issue about emunah, and the Jewish people, their current commentary is still to this day that word does not mean faith there. It means faithfulness, meaning obedience. The obedience or steadfastness is actually the Hebrew literal word. It's like if you had to hold up your hands. Moses, when he held up his hands, he was emunah. He was steadfastly holding up his hands in a certain situation. So this is why this is the actual controversy that matches the dispute between Paul, the spouter. Now we know they called him the spouter of lies, and the Zadik. Okay, anyway, so I guess I'm being too nice here. If Professor Eisenman is correct, no, it's beyond doubt. But if he's correct, let's just take that position. This means the Ebionites and Eusebius' writings are the Jerusalem church under James. What Professor Eisenman then notes to corroborate this idea is that Paul refers twice to sending money to the poor at Jerusalem. Oh yeah, that's another thing. Paul actually refers to them as the poor. And Eisenman is actually saying, okay, hold on. Eisenman says this just as easily could be the poor, meaning poor, capital P. This is in Romans 15, verse 26, and Galatians 2, verses 9 to 10. Now, just at the time I wrote this, I forgot or didn't correlate that Jerome himself, in his commentary on Galatians 2, verses 9 to 10, you will find Jerome says, the poor to whom Paul is referring to is the church of the apostles, because he knows the guy who's translated the Bible knows better than anyone who the Ebion are. And also you have to imagine that he's writing around 380 whatever, and all these purges of all the documents are coming. They haven't yet happened, and it's going to sweep away his translations of the original Gospel of Matthew, because those are now Ebion writings. He's translated the original Gospel from the Hebrew into both Latin and Greek, and he had all these wonderful praises through his through his works. He has 22 quotes of it in his commentaries on Matthew. He's got it mentioned numerous times and quoted, and he uses it as a way of proof texting his translations of the Greek. He uses the Hebrew Matthew to do that, and he does all this work, and then it's destroyed. His two copies, he did a Latin and he did a Greek, and he makes no mention that he's going to destroy his own work. So this had to have been purged and destroyed, despite the tremendous value it would have had to have seen what our original Matthew said. It was destroyed, ladies and gentlemen. That's how afraid the Catholic Church was of the truth. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls also had to be buried, and they were hoping they would never have to release them to the public. They had set it all up that only certain scholars that they approved of could ever get access and see the original Dead Sea Scrolls. So they thought they were going to capture it forever. And Eisenman, what he did is he took the plates, the photo plates that were taken under the Rockefeller Foundation grants, whatever, and there was no guarantee that the Rockefeller Foundation couldn't allow somebody else to publish those plates, and that's what Eisenman did, and that's what broke the logjam. And the only reason any of us know anything that's truthful about the Dead Sea Scrolls is the wonderful work of Professor Eisenman, and one day he needs to be crowned as one of the most wonderful benefactors of history, because without him, we would never have known what I'm telling you now about the poor. This was deliberately trying to be hidden and deliberately skewed to make you think this was an Essene sect. And I'm going to say it again. The Essenes are never mentioned once, not once, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet the myth was created over 40 years by the Catholic scholars that this must have been a Essene community when there was absolutely not a shred of evidence to prove it. Mistaking a clay plate factory for a plates for a monastery, mistaking Qumran as some sort of scriptorum where people are making copies of things, yet there's not a single evidence of tables or desks where people could do this. They're just caves. It was clearly security. These books were taken there to preserve them from some other place. It was obvious from day one. And I'm rereading Gold right now, and he's basically saying that there was the evidence at the beginning. They knew this was not a scriptorum, but they started to go the wrong way, and then they just kept going that way. Anyway, let me just see here. So if we translate back Paul's words into Hebrew, he was saying the Ebion of Jerusalem was the name of the church under James in those two passages. They were the congregation of the poor, just like we might call the church of the Lighthouse Church today. We do not see Paul's intent due to the case size in the standard text, which changes the poor, capital P, into the poor, small p. What heightens the probability Professor Eisenman is correct is recent archaeology. So I guess I just said this, but let's hear what this says. The initial hypothesis was that the Dead Sea Scrolls were exclusively the writings of an Essene sect from 200 BC era. This idea recently crumbled in 2004. Golb's contrary hypothesis that the Dead Sea Scrolls came from the temple at Jerusalem between 65 and 70 AD has now been strongly confirmed by extensive archaeological digs under the auspices of Israeli universities. These digs proved there was no community site of monks at Qumran. It was a clay plate factory. The initial inference of a large community of monks from the presence of a large number of plates misinterpreted the evidence. Second, we can now infer the scrolls were hidden in the mountains to protect the scrolls, and not because a large community had been involved in copying activity. In fact, archaeology now proves there was no copy center or scriptorum as originally claimed. None of the metal clips copyists used to guide copying were found at Qumran. A few ordinary pens and numerous coins were found, yet no metal clips of copyists, not even a fragment of one. The very nature of the scrolls likewise demonstrate that no monkish community was engaged in copying them. The Dead Sea Scrolls, it turns out, are not only an eclectic, meaning from all kinds of points of view. So there's no one sectarian point of view in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It looks like, I'm going to comment here, it looks like the leaders of the library, there was a library at the temple, everybody knew that, is they were collecting sectarian works, meaning, hey, let's keep track of the Ebion, let's get some of their writings, and let's make copies of their writings and keep it here just so that we know who they are. Let's get another document from another group, and we're going to keep it here. But again, it's just amazing that if the Essenes were so important, why don't they even have one document about the Essenes anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Not one. Not one. Okay. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, it turns out, are not only an eclectic selection of sectarian material, but also a cache with numerous copies of the Bible text. So it's a mix. It's a mix of Bible text and sectarian, very, very varied and very different points of view from different sects. This is just what one would expect to find from the Temple Library of Jerusalem, had it been secreted away in advance of the Roman troops sieging Jerusalem prior to 70 AD. The Essenes would not be expected, by contrast, to preserve several opposing strains of sectarian writings, like the Ebion. One such strain is the writings of the poor, the Ebion. On the other hand, we would expect to find Jewish rabbis at Jerusalem wanting to keep copies of Christian writings for informational purposes at the library of the Temple of Jerusalem. We would expect to find records of sectarian differences maintained by such a library. So it's exactly what we would expect. Golb's argument has now essentially been vindicated. Golb made a scholarly case that the Dead Sea Scroll writings that were taken from the temple at Jerusalem during the years of the Roman siege that finally prevailed in 70 AD. Hiding them in these caves preserved them from the torches which in the end destroyed the temple in 70 AD after a long siege. Thus, recent archaeological discoveries at Qumran established that many of the documents can be potentially prepared in the Christian era. Well, more than that, it's just obviously it was. We no longer are forced to disregard the Christian character of certain writings merely because the Essene hypotheses, which strangled the Dead Sea Scroll studies until now. It strangled it while the Catholics controlled the narrative, and that's what they were doing. It's just like, if you can control the narrative and never let the Ebion appear in history again, because we censored them once, we're going to censor them again. But ladies and gentlemen, thank God for Professor Eisenman, but for him, we would never know the truth. Among the newer writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find some in Hebrew written by a group calling itself the Ebion, the poor. And then I even, actually, this is from my book. This is the book chapter, and so I go through the trial of Paul and their findings and so on. And also the Damascus document was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it also had been found previously in the early 1900s, 1908 I think it was. I have to go back here and get the dates. But this document was already concluded to be a sect of Christians. That's so at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found a document that scholars had all concluded 50 years earlier was a Christian document, because we could see who it was. The consensus in 1910, here it is, George Margaluth of the British Museum in 1910 and 11 had concluded that the Damascus document was written about the time of the destruction of the Second Temple near 70 AD, perfect, and was the work of Sadducean Christians of Damascus, okay, because they find it out in Damascus. They conclude it must have been written by Christians in that area, not imagining that anybody could have actually just transported it from maybe Jerusalem over here to Damascus. But whatever. The point is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a document that already had been pre-vetted and predetermined to be from Christians because of the words on the page. Okay, so that means that the argument that Reisman is making is inherently valid. So the Damascus document, which is a work of the Ebion, again, was confirmed and already ruled to be Christian well before the Dead Sea Scrolls were ever found, because that particular document wasn't only at the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was found 50 years earlier out in the desert of Syria near Damascus. Okay, so I mean, it's really, the evidence is now overwhelming that Professor Eisenman is correct. Let me see if there's anything else here. Okay. And then we have all these one-sided charges against them. And you know what? I guess we should include what Epiphanius says was the findings. So they made an investigation of Paul. So besides concluding that Paul was an apostate, this is what they also concluded. This is Epiphanius Panarian 30.16.6-9. They declare that he, Paul, was a Greek. He went up to Jerusalem, they say, and when he had spent some time there, he was seized with the passion to marry the daughter of the priest. For this reason, he became a proselyte and was circumcised. Then, when he failed to get the girl, he flew into a rage and wrote against circumcision and against the Sabbath and the law. Okay, so this is Epiphanius is being, what can you say? He's not trying to say anything nice particularly about them, but the point is he's just saying these are their findings. And that, if you notice, this is a very judicial statement, meaning it's like you would expect a court to decide. Okay. Now, this idea that Paul was Greek, people go, "Oh, that can't be." Well, think about it again. First of all, in Acts 21, when Paul is, or 22, Acts 21 or 22, Paul is being grabbed by a crowd, and the Romans are grabbing him away from them. And then Paul turns to the legion chief and he says, "Can I speak to the crowd?" And the legion chief turns around and says, "You speak Greek?" And so obviously Paul had addressed him in Greek. It was a question. And it's what's so remarkable is Luke even recorded that little interchange, which you might have skipped over. That's how we learn that Paul can speak Greek. Okay, and so the fact that he writes in Greek isn't because he's illiterate and somebody else is writing for him. He could write it. The only reason he had someone help him is he maybe had vision problems and wasn't able to write anymore. But he was able to speak Greek. He was able to write in Greek. He was born, he said, in Tarsus, which is basically at that time Greek. It's right across the peninsula from Greece. So anyway, there is evidence that you would conclude he's Greek. And why is this important? Because in the book of Revelation, one of the things is that they say they are Jews, but they are not. So you have Paul, who really is Greek, but he says he's Jewish, which he probably did have Jewish blood. He had to have the Benjamite wolf true, in that you could still be part of a tribe, but you are not legally recognized, meaning there were non-Torah rules about you have to have a mother who's Jewish, but the lineage is all covered through your father. So that's another Jewish tradition, or that's actually biblically required. But the point is that they concluded that Paul was not truly Jewish, which means he didn't truly have a Jewish mother under Jewish non-Torah law, but still it's a law. So that's how they concluded that, and that fits in with those in the book of Revelation. There's these critiques about those who say they're an apostle but aren't, those who teach you can eat meat sacrificed to idols, and then quotes even Paul from on the deep things of Satan, deep things of God. Jesus calls the deep things of Satan. He's mocking Paul's words. I mean, I've told you that. Thyatira, the message to Thyatira. And then they come to the conclusion that in another chapter 3, they'll say there are those who say they are Jews but are not. They are of the synagogue of Satan. So Renan also said that was another reference to Paul because of, I think he was very aware, the Panarian had the Ebion concluding that Paul was not truly Jewish. He was Greek. So, and that's plausible. Okay, just told you the evidence. And then I think we've covered his Herodian connection. Definitely he was related to Herod, had a relative he called Herodion, I think her name was. And then he even is said and described in the book of Acts as being a playmate of King Herod the Tetrarch. And it's only punctuated so you can't see that, but it says Menaeus was a playmate of both Herod the Tetrarch and Paul. So these proofs, show that Paul had a Greek upbringing, was brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. Somehow he's related to them, and he's not truly Jewish. But he, like the Herodians, they all wanted to be Jewish, but, their own heritage, legally speaking, in Jewish rabbinic law, you couldn't be Jewish unless your mother was Jewish. So that was it. Okay, I think that we're going to end this here. This is a bit long, 29 more minutes, but I think it'll be useful.